Well, welcome, church history friends. My name is Barb Walden, and it's a joy to welcome you to the second program in the 2021 Church History Without Boundaries lecture series. Thank you all for joining us at a new time today. We've changed our schedule for the next few weeks to accommodate the time zones of our speakers. And we welcome our global storytellers and listeners from all around the world. Thank you all for joining us today. I have a few introductions and quick announcements to share before I hand things over to Joey Williams, our gracious host today. Joey is likely a familiar face for many as he serves as the Mission Center President for the Eastern and Western Europe Mission Centers, in addition to his many years of service in a variety of roles all over the world for Community of Christ. Welcome, Joey. It's really good to see you today. Our second host, helping out behind the scenes, is Wendy Eaton. In addition to answering questions and dropping information in the chat and solving all sorts of mysteries behind the scenes today, Wendy also serves as the administrative assistant for the Joseph Smith Historic Site and the Community of Christ Historic Sites Foundation. She does a little bit of everything. So welcome, Wendy. Today's program is being recorded and will be made available after the program is over. We'll record all of our online programs throughout the series, and we'll post links to the videos on our website and our YouTube channel. In fact, you can catch all the lecture recordings from our previous series over the past 2 years on our website, which the address, as you see, appears on the screen. Speaking of past programs, I hope you all had the chance to share in the online Heritage Day Hymn Festival we shared with the Toronto Center Place a few weeks ago. If not, you can view the video featuring all of the sites and music from the past. Go to our website for the link to the Hymn Festival video. Our website also includes links to all 3 of Wendy's Project Zion podcast episodes that explored the stories of these 3 women, Emmeline, Bertha, and Ada. Also, our friends from Liberty Hall hosted their first Joseph Smith III Peace Lecture this past Heritage Day. Jim Doty was the guest speaker. So if you missed it, you can catch the video on our website. I'm telling you, there's a lot of content available on the website for you church history lovers. Our friends over at the British Isles Latter-day Saint History Association continue to offer great online programs. Their most recent lecture with Peter Gaffney is now available online. The History Association will also be hosting a new lecture at the end of the month that Andrew will tell us all about later. All of the announcement details will also be included in the closing slides at the end of today's program. So if you didn't have a chance to write anything down, don't worry, it'll all appear at the end of the program. And lastly, our friends at the John Whitmer Historical Association will host their annual conference virtually this year. The conference will take place next weekend, so be sure to register soon as the registration deadline closes at the end of the day tomorrow. Wendy will include the link in the chat for you to check out this year's schedule of the presenters and session topics. And again, all of this will be included at the end of today's program, just in case you missed a link or a date, as I've shared the announcements in rapid fire today. Also, a friendly reminder that donations received throughout the Church History Without Boundaries lecture series will go to preserving and maintaining Community of Christ historic sites. The funds will be used to develop new educational programs on church history and fund young adults in the Alma Blair internship program. That's young adults who serve at the historic sites and really throughout. The online donation link and mailing address is in the chats. We simply couldn't host programs like today without your generous support. So thank you so much, friends. And that's it for the church history announcements for today. I'll turn things over to Joey, our host, to begin an exciting discussion on the life and legacy of Kisuke Sekine.
Thank you, Barb. Today, we will talk about the impactful life story of Apostle Kisuke Sekine. And who better to tell this story than Andrew Bolton and Phil Caswell, as they both knew Sekine on a personal level for many years. They worked alongside him, shared ministry in the field with him, and considered him a dear friend. Phil Caswell served the church with his family in Seoul, South Korea for 11 years. And during this time, he grew to know Brother Sekine. And who knew that later he would serve with him as a colleague in the Council of 12 Apostles. And when Brother Sekine served as the apostle in Asia, he invited Andrew and Jewel Bolton to come and work in the church's school in Tokyo. And this began a friendship with Brother and Sister Sekine that continued until his passing. And just imagine what that friendship meant when Andrew himself, many years later, became an apostle for the Asia field. It was an assignment that Andrew says would not have been possible without Apostle Sekine's mentorship. And last, we have a truly great bonus, a treat for us today. Uilani Ishikawa is joining us from Hawaii, where she lives with her family, and she will be sharing some of the more recent history in Japan. And it's bright and early on the islands today, so we really appreciate her getting up to be with us. Ui has been working remotely, serving the Far East since the spring of 2020. Ui is a field minister for the Pacific Asia field in Community of Christ, and she has been a beneficiary as well as an avid supporter of Sekine's legacy for the past 8 years. So thank you all for being here today to reflect on Kisuke Sekine's unique story. And I'll now turn things over to Andrew Bolton to begin our discussion.
So I'm thrilled to be with you and my colleagues in telling this story. In Asia, Community of Christ is walking in the footsteps of 3 people. The first is the Buddha. Everywhere I went in Asia, I found the quiet, still presence of the Buddha. Brother Sekine grew up in a Buddhist culture and felt blessed by that. Secondly, we cannot tell the story of Community of Christ in Asia without talking about the apostle of the poor, Charles Neff, perhaps the greatest apostle since World War II. He was a mentor to Phil and Brother Sekine and many others, and I felt privileged to have met him. And these are the countries he helped establish. And thirdly, we must also tell the story of Kisuke Sekine, the first apostle, not of European heritage. He was a leader in Japan and Asia, a devoted father and husband. And Brother Phil is now going to tell his part of the story. Over to you, Phil.
Thanks, Andrew. I met Kisuke Sekine in Graceland when we were both students there. And from that introduction, a friendship developed and continued through almost 5 decades. Our relationship was deep and personal and characterized by respect and affection. This didn't happen immediately, of course, but grew and matured over time. When our family was assigned to Korea, several factors combined to increase our opportunities to interact. A major decision for the church to open the work in the Orient was supported by Apostle Charles Neff's family moved to Tokyo, as Andrew has mentioned. The team recruited several young men, including Brother Sekine, Hiroshi Yamada, Brother Matsushita, and Gary Beebe and the Ron Yeager families also were part of the early team. After a time, Brother Neff wanted to expand the church presence to Okinawa and asked Sekine to lead the effort. My understanding is that Sekine was reluctant to go, but he and his family did move and established a church presence, including a kindergarten, which is still flourishing. It's no small task for a, quote, outsider, quote, to establish roots like the Zucchini family demonstrated. you probably know what it's like to go to a different area of the country where the language and the customs and the practices are different from your own. Kisuke started his efforts in Okinawa by answering an advertisement in the newspaper. There was an announcement about a meeting of the Boy Scouts. He showed up early, unannounced, and asked how he could help. I think he did some janitorial work that night. He continued to show up for the Scouts and showed that he wanted to help them any way he could. The amazing thing to me is that over time, he qualified as a trainer of leaders for the Scouts in Okinawa. Along the way, he met the Crown Prince, who was also involved with the Sea Scouts there on the island. Someone told me that Zucchini and the Crown Prince became friends, and Zucchini was welcome to visit, quote, anytime he was in Tokyo. It's quite a difference from being an outsider to having been invited in this way. He and I had other encounters in the Asia Pacific conferences that were held regularly under Brother Neff's leadership. Kisuke was friendly, considerate of others, and participated confidently in discussions. He knew how to collaborate. The Japan mission arranged for a professional to translate the Book of Mormon, and my understanding is that the mission team mentioned earlier edited the work done. I do not have firsthand knowledge of the usage or role of this scripture in Japan, but I do remember a conversation with two senior members of the congregation. I asked what they thought about the book. Their only reply was, "We don't like war." This may suggest one isolated reply to the question, or may point out one of the issues that affects the acceptance of this scripture in Japan. As Andrew mentioned, Brother Neff was a mentor to all of us, and the time came when he wanted to invite Zucchini to consider full-time appointment. We invited, with Brother Neff's approval, for Zucchini to visit Korea and talk it over. He and I had several days to eat kimchi, look around Seoul, and talk about the cultural challenges. Here's an example of one time he showed his skills and expertise. I wanted to introduce him to 4 young men who are teaching at our school for youth. It involved 4 Koreans, all teachers, a Japanese national, Zucchini, and a white foreigner, me. The teachers were having a good time until they spotted Zucchini and I coming through the door. It got quiet immediately, and the atmosphere was tense. Zucchini couldn't talk to the men in English. They would consider that to be an insult, and they would be angry if he spoke to them in Japanese. All of us knew the memories of war and domination and unresolved conflicts between Korea and Japan. With a slight turn of his body, he whispered to me, quote, "Please tell these men that he had heard of the good service they were providing to the students. It's a good example of respect and service to all of us," end of quote. His quick response changed the atmosphere entirely, and we had a civil conversation together. Brother Zucchini did accept appointment, but attitudes like which I just referred to go deep and do not soften quickly. His command of English was legendary, but it was the result of continual study and practice. I heard him tell of his time at Graceland. This was a long time after we had finished our study there, and he tried to learn 50 new words a day to increase his English vocabulary. 50 words a day. I also remember an incident in Okinawa, excuse me. He and I were on a hilltop on the north point of the island. Believe me, the view was magnificent. The site was a memorial to all the Japanese soldiers who died during the Second World War. This was a functional equivalent to our Arlington Cemetery. I asked him if he would point out the province that included his home area. He looked at me and said, "You want to see the honorarium to a barbarian?" No, absolutely not. That never crossed my mind. Come on, let's get out of here. And he replied and smiled, I was just kidding. There is a potential for misunderstanding when one works across cultures, but my friendship with Sekine-san and a few others has helped expand my perception and desires to identify attitudes and principles that reflect divine characteristics. Our friendship also laid bare several of my own biases. That's not a very pleasant exercise, believe me, but it's worth working at to strengthen relationships. He and I also served together in the Council of 12. I saw his depth and unusual ability to communicate well in a second language. He had the gifts of a mature Japanese disciple. In discussions, he was informed, skillful, and relational. He did not seek to dominate. He had a deep understanding of the gospel. He also experienced unusual attacks and hurtful words like, quote, pagan apostle, end of quote. This happened at times when he ministered in the States. I never recall any discussion with him about that kind of abuse, but this brief reference today reminds me of my desire to seek bridges and perspectives in the gospel that point to one world under God. We have and seek a future in the cause of the kingdom that's rooted in the gift of Christ, but it needs to include all people and encourages us to act in the spirit of that commitment. Sekine's friendship has encouraged me to be that kind of man.
Thank you, Phil, for your personal testimony of Brother Sekine. So I just want to begin by saying, in assessing Apostle Sekine's life and contribution, I want to begin with my personal relationship with him. I also want to say something about Apostle Sekine's cultural background, and then his partnership with Saku, his wife, and then his messianic vision, and finally his wonderful concern for people, especially children. So the first thing for me to say is that Brother Sekine was very, very honorable in all his dealings with me. He invited Jewel and I to go to Japan when he saw our application for church employment turned down in 1981. At that time, Brother Sekine was an apostle and I was teaching biology in an 11 to 18-year-old's age state school near Oxford, England. I'd known the church about 9 years, been baptized 8. Jewel and I had been married just 4 years. Brother Sekine did not know us, but he spoke with others who did. I hesitated for 6 weeks about going to Japan, but Jewel, my lovely wife, was enthusiastic. And so finally we said, yes, we will come. I rang him up, which was a big deal in those days and expensive, to say we accepted his invitation. He said, checking to make sure we were now really committed. So are we talking business? I was a little taken aback by that direct phrase, but we affirmed, yes, we were ready to come if he still wanted us. And the position was still open. So we arrived to come to serve in the Seijo English Academy and Nursery School for 2 years, 1982 to 1984. It was a momentous time. We had these wonderful children to teach. And our Matthew was just 15 months old when we arrived in Seijo, Tokyo. And we arrived just as the cherry blossom trees lining the streets of Seijo were beginning to flower. A glorious sight. With a horticultural background, I mean, this was heaven. Our time in Japan was a wonderful, transforming time. Now, Japan is a formal politeness culture, and so also are some forms of British culture. So I understand correctness and politeness. It was a no-no for me to address Apostle Sekine by his first name, Kazuki. So I never, ever did. So we always said, Brother Sekine, Apostle Sekine, or Sekine Sensei. Now, Sensei is an honorable title for a teacher. It's something like professor in status. And Jewel and I were also called Sensei because we were teachers in the school. It was wonderful to be in a culture like Japan, where teachers are so respected. Our status went up. Whilst we were in Tokyo, Sekine Sensei was always so encouraging to Jewel and I, and unfailingly kind to little Matthew. Matthew learned Japanese fluently, but was very practical. He knew Brother Sekine knew English, and so always spoke English with him. It was a great joy in 1983 to participate in the Asia Pacific Conference in Manila, Philippines. Apostle Sekine sponsored us for church employment after our 2 years in Japan, and he advised us to make sure Jewel and I were interviewed face-to-face in Independence. So instead of flying directly back home to England, we went via Independence. His strategy worked, we were employed. But 10 months later, I was fired. At this very difficult time, Brother Sekine's loyalty and support was exceptional. He protested vigorously in the Joint Council on my behalf, and that meant a great deal to me. I began the healing. I've thought many times since of how loyal he was to me then, and how he always saw the best in me, and I was a nobody. After being fired by the church, I taught multi-faith religious education in England for 13 years, inspired by our Japanese experience. Then in 1998, I came back to work for the church, coordinating peace and justice ministries. And Phil's wife is the one that spotted the job and put it in front of me. Darlene, thank you, Darlene. It was a big surprise for me to be called in 2007 into the Council of 12 Apostles, and then to be given Asia as my field, the same position that Brother Sekine and also Charles Neff once held. Indeed, when I look back, I see the hand of God working through Apostle Sekine in his vision and kindness to prepare me for that time. We'd continued to share Christmas cards and messages every year since we left Japan. And when Jack Kirkpatrick, the previous apostle, and I visited in October 2007, just after being ordained an apostle, it was a deep experience with both Sekine sensei and Saku sensei, his wife. We visited Brother Sekine in hospital. He had cancer, which was terminal. But despite being so ill, he was very alert and had suggestions of books and articles for me to read. He was so pleased to see us both. He was still my mentor. I so appreciate his commitment to be fully human among other humans, whatever race or nationality. At the same time, it has to be a human unity out of the rich diversity of cultures. His witness of our common humanity, and thus the possibility of peace, has made a deep mark in my own soul. So this is Brother Sekine at the conference. This is Jewel and baby Matthew. And this is me at the back. And it's very disturbing. I look like my son David looks these days. So Japanese cultural background. There's a famous book about Japan written in 1946 by an anthropologist called Ruth Benedict. It's called The Chrysanthemum and the Sword. And she was suggesting there were two kinds of Japan. There's the Japan of samurai and violence that was seen in a distorted form in World War II and was supported by nationalist Shintoism. Then there's another Japan of cherry blossom, chrysanthemums, tea ceremonies, supported by Buddhism. Sekine sensei identified with the gentle, non-violent, peaceful Buddhist expression of Japanese culture. That's very important to understand. Apostle Sekine valued his Buddhist cultural background, and this at times was terribly misunderstood in the States, and sometimes combined with racism. Brother Caswell has already referred to him hurtfully being called a pagan apostle. Understandably, many Americans had no appreciation of Buddhism, as it was far from their experience. But this is an ancient, highly ethical faith committed to nonviolence, with both a profound analysis of suffering and the human condition, and also a way out of our mess. I think Jesus and Buddha are friends. This comes from my assessment, from careful study and reflection. And if we think of the Buddha like Isaiah or Jeremiah or Moses in the Old Testament, we have some idea of the equivalence of his stature, perhaps, and the fact that Jesus would have embraced him if they had met personally. I think part of the Sermon on the Mount is inspired by teachings of the Buddha, but that's another story. Now, racism is a United States problem as it is a European problem. The stereotyping is the oversimplification that all of us make. I want to contrast my experience of being in the States. I was married to Jewel, an American. I came from the British Isles, the land of F. Henry Edwards, Arthur Oakman, Will Timms, Harry Black. Our nations were allies in World War I, World War II, and since. People respected my culture. I was a native speaker of English, and some people even liked my British accent. So I had it really easy. Brother Sekine didn't. And I admire so much his courage. I wouldn't have done it. I wouldn't have faced what he had to face. But he did so deeply Christian and suffered in his calling. So let's come to Graceland College now. So Brother Sekine came in contact with an American church family somehow and became their houseboy in Tokyo. They were church members and they invited him and got him to go to Graceland. So he went to Graceland around 1953. I think he was very brave. The war was only a few years before. So the young college student, Sekine-san, somehow persuaded girlfriend Saku to follow him to Graceland College in America. She came in 1955. And she came by boat to San Francisco and then by train all the way to Lamoni. I mean, Zucchini sensei was brave. She's super brave. And they graduated in 1957. And when Jack Kirkpatrick and I were visiting, it was their 50th anniversary. And because of Sekine sensei's illness, it was impossible for them to go to that 50th reunion. But Jack Kirkpatrick and I brought them reunion materials. It was on this occasion that Saku told me of her journey to Graceland. And I've just outlined it. I mean, imagine coming to Lamoni in January. It's a godforsaken, bitterly cold time. She was met at the station, of course, in Lamoni by Sekine-san, who took her to the college. Dr. Roy Cheville had organized a choir to welcome her. And they sang that wonderful hymn, "In Christ there is no east or west." It deeply touched Saku, and she was emotional as she told me the story 52 years later. So they were married, and they had 2 children and were partners in the Zion Kindergarten, Okinawa, that they established together. And their daughter, Michio, the young girl in this picture, is the principal today. Now, Brother Sekine got Zion. He got the church seal. He and Saku had grown up in World War II. They saw firsthand the horror and tragedy of war. And so Zion is lamb and lion led by a little child. Peace on earth, the end of war, the end of poverty, healing of relationships, healing of the earth. And one major way of realizing the vision of Zion for Brother and Sister Sekine was through the education of children. So that inspired the beginning of the nursery school, Zion Kindergarten, in Naha, Okinawa, in 1963. As Phil mentioned, the Sekines were sent by Brother Charles Neff for 2 years, but it turned out to be their life work. Brother and Sister Sekine believed it was possible to bring Zion nearer one child at a time through this wonderful kindergarten. Older teachers at the kindergarten told me how Brother and Sister Sekine guided them with insight and compassion and love and gentleness for the children. The dream of Zion included insight into child psychology. And this is the deputy head of the school who'd been there for 20 years when I talked with her. And she talked so warmly of Brother Sekine's contribution to her teaching skills. And I've already mentioned how kind, authentically kind, he was to Matthew. Now, Sister Saku was an educator in her own right and received a prestigious award for being an outstanding educator in my time in Japan. And then there's the story of Aso-san. He was working in a printing business in Okinawa and somehow came across a leaflet advertising Spanish lessons. Perhaps he was printing it. He was interested and started attending the class that was actually hosted by the Community of Christ congregation in Okinawa. Through the class, Aso-san met Sekine sensei. He says of Sekine sensei and the congregation, quote, "They saved my life." He was able to overcome a drinking problem, straighten out his life in important ways, and is a dear brother in the church. We're now going to have Uilani Ishikawa talk about the church in Japan today. I want to say I have enormous respect for Ui. Over to you, Ui. You may need to unmute. Oh, you're screen sharing. I'm sorry.
Get my video back on and unmute. Okay. Okay. So thank you. I hope I'm not repeating too much. And like Barb said earlier, I was kind of pulled in at the last minute. So I'll just share briefly an update of what's going on right now. Everyone can hear me okay? Okay. So as Barb also said, the members and friends in Japan they know we're having this meeting today. They're aware of the lecture and they were excited actually to join today, but it's 2 a.m. over there right now. So, but they send their warm greetings and kind regards. So, yoroshiku onegai shimasu. So there are two congregations, as has been mentioned. One's just outside of Tokyo to the south, in Setagaya, and other in Okinawa Prefecture. So that in Ginowan. So like many congregations around the world, both Seijo and Okinawa churches are much smaller these days, but as far as active members goes, but both locations continue to operate nursery schools, which serve and interact with the communities around them in a variety of ways. So this has been a wonderful blessing, especially as of late, because the schools, both schools were able to continue operating throughout the pandemic. So we check in with them every other week or so and see how things are going as school and the children continue. So since Kisuke's wife, Saku-san, passed away recently, Micho Sensei is the only surviving member of the Sekine family. She has, for many years, and is currently, as Andrew said, she's serving as the principal of Zion Nursery School. They pronounce it Shion Nursery School in Okinawa. So to the top left there, on the left side, that's the former principal, Komaki Sensei. She's actually still working there, teaching art. In the center, next to Komaki Sensei is Hiromi-san. That's the pastor there, and she also teaches Bible classes to the students each week. And then finally, next to her is Hiramatsu Sensei, the current principal of the school. And these photos are a little bit old now, but on the right side also is a little bit older staff photo and an English class on the bottom. So every year the students and staff work very, very hard to prepare the Christmas program. This photo on the left side was featured in the Herald, I believe, a few years back. And then on the right side is the hall in Okinawa. In addition to the Christmas program, we hold an annual candles ceremony there on the right each year in the sanctuary. And yes, they give the children fire, but they're closely watched. And then on the bottom left is a photo of students at recess. That's a picture of the playground, or what they call the garden area. In November, the Japanese people celebrate the children in the Shichigo-san, or 753 Shichigo-san festival. So in coordination with that, the church ministers, in cooperation with the nursery school staff, held an annual children's blessing ceremony for the oldest blue butterfly students. That's them pictured there. The last time I went back was 2019, before kind of this global pandemic started out. This is just a little bit older graduation class photo. Every year in May, they have this ceremony, and that's the chapel there. So the church in Japan never actually changed its name to Community of Christ, and due to like overly complicated legal process. So it's still actually known as Fukugen Iesu Kiristo Kyokai, which is something like the Restored Church. So these are some of the church members pictured here, not all of them. And so my most recent visit to Zion in Okinawa was 2019. And there is Micho Sensei pictured here, and she is teaching a Bible lesson to the students gathered there. And the large photo on the right here is one of the most recent photos, including both Hiroshi and Mizuko Yamada with visiting Apostle Mareva and Field Bishop Mark Urett. We're planning to go back as soon as things kind of open back up. We have a lot of business to tend to and decisions to make, but we're kind of in limbo right now. So, and I think Phil mentioned the north tip of Okinawa in the view there, and this is Cape Hedo, where the monument is, and the Peace Pole. So as you can see, Sekine's legacy is very much alive and well in Japan and in the world still today. Not only do the churches and nursery schools continue to serve their surrounding communities, but both generate enough income each year to support mission in the Pacific Asia field and worldwide. So in this way, the generosity of our sisters and brothers in Japan, and of course, the continuing legacy of Kisuke Sekine can be felt around the world. So that's it. Arigatou gozaimasu.
Thank you, Ui. We're inviting Phil just to give a few words in closing about Apostle Sekine's contribution. Phil?
This is a wonderful experience for us to be sharing in a modest way about our friend and colleague, Kisuke Sekine. Our movement has growing experience in cross-cultural ministry. We have some unique gifts, and those are worthy of sharing. We're growing in confidence and ability in doing that. But we're also learning the deep importance of listening. I remember hearing that counsel very early during my first job in a small town in southern Iowa. My boss was an Orthodox Jew, and he said, "Philip, I'd like you to look in the mirror. Notice that you have one mouth and two ears. Try to live in that relationship." Now, that was not an easy thing to hear from my boss, and I'm still learning that lesson as well. But through the ministry of current disciples, including Joey, we're learning to look for and identify cultural equivalents, which can indicate forerunners of the ministry of Jesus Christ. We're reminded in our own scriptures about God has many forces at work. It's humbling to recognize that. But what a privilege to be part of a movement that is increasing our understanding and seeking ways to live it out in faithfulness.
Thank you, Phil. Over to you, Joey.
Yes, well, thank you, all three of you, Phil, Andrew, and Ui. It has been such a pleasure to be able to hear you share your thoughts on the life and legacy of Kisuke Sekine. And we've now come to that moment in our program where we open up the floor to any audience questions that may have surfaced in the discussion today. So I just want to remind you there should be at the bottom of your screen somewhere a Q&A button, or you might have to go to a button that says more and then push Q&A to put in any questions that you might have that have surfaced as you've listened to these different presentations. And I think, Barb, there's already a question or two in the box, so we'll go to you for the first question.
Sure. We are hearing from Susan Oxley, and Susan asks, tell us more about the annual blessing ceremony.
Sure. So many years ago, I can't say the years, probably Bolton sensei knows, but they used to do a children's blessing. I believe Matsushita sensei's wife, who I never met, but used to do the blessing. And then for many years it stopped for I don't know what reason, but I found out that, and then maybe the second or third year I was living there in Tokyo, I thought that's a missed opportunity. So we started that back up. And again, there's a holiday already there that they celebrate. And so in coordination with that, we did the blessing. And so the staff and church members together have to work on translations and everything. So the parents, most of them do speak English, but yeah. Andrew, did you want to add anything?
So I think we're sacramental tradition as one of our blessings. And I think this is a really lovely adaptation of that sacramental tradition in Japanese culture, and very meaningful for the children and for their parents, and a plus in the school. And I'm very grateful that Ui had the nous to revive it. Well done, Ui.
Our next question comes from Gail Anderson, and Gail says, the Sekines, the congregation and the teachers were very hospitable to us, a young family living on Okinawa in 1978 through 80. At a large gathering in the Sekine home, we removed our shoes, as was the custom. When we all were ready to leave, we were horrified to see that our toddler, Robin, had mixed up and scattered the shoes of all gathered there. There was no irritation, only good-natured laughs. Was Apostle Sekine's parents approving of his ministry in the church?
I don't know. That's a good question. We still take our shoes off in our house. We learned that from Japan. It's a very civilized thing to do. But about his relationship with his parents, I have no idea. Michio-san may know about that. Maybe Brother Yamada may know about that.
We have another request from Susan Oxley, and she's asked to tell us more about the monument and peace pole on the tip of Okinawa.
Andrew, you may have more recent experience than I, but I will just say briefly, this was quite a small display. The space for Tokyo, for example, which I understand is a separate province, was quite small. And they were, I don't know, what, 6 or 8 feet wide, and about that. Is that your memory, Andrew, or do you know about that?
What's my memory? I remember the graves, but I also remember the Peace Museum in Okinawa. It's a wonderful peace museum, and it's very critical of the war, very critical of Japanese imperialism and the martial mentality of that time. People in Okinawa really suffered during the war. So if you ever have a chance to go to Okinawa, go. I've been to the museum twice. It's very, very moving. So in Okinawa, you have a peace tradition that's very beautiful. and some resentment about the continuing presence of the American base there. So I was touched and inspired by the peace witness through the museum in Okinawa. In fact, I wrote an article about it.
Dave and Donna, Tiffany asked, does the church still have a presence in Korea?
The answer is yes. There's been there's been a major change in perception and some in location in Seoul, but the original compound where Darlene and our family lived, that was also shared earlier with Les Gardner and his family and Ralph Ferret and his family, and a caretaker, was sold because the value of the land in that area had just skyrocketed, and it was the thing to do to sell it and find other locations, which was done. Andrew knows much more about that, I'm sure. But the church and a center in Seoul is located in a multi-story building in downtown Seoul. And they rent facilities, but also have worship and classes and multi ministries that are there. Andrew, you may have quite a bit more to add to that.
So when they sold the building, and they got an enormous amount of money for that, and have built this wonderful 5 or 6 story new building. And Gary Logan has to be credited with seeing that through. And then we've had the ministry of Steve Shields in the past, Elizabeth Else as a volunteer, World Service Corps volunteer, Adam Wade, Matthew, and Irene. And it was Matthew working with you in the blessing I saw in Seijo. So we've had people from outside give leadership, like the Caswells gave leadership, but now we have Korean nationals leading the church there. I loved going to Korea. It was always a blessing when I went there. Ui, do you have any recent updates?
Not very much more, but the pastoral team now is doing very well, working together. Hyune leading that up, and since they're not able to meet in person, they do meet every week online, and that's been going very well, I'd say. Hopefully, well, as soon as things open back up, they'll be able to meet in person, but they are still thriving. There's a lot of young adults there actually active, and so anyway, yes, they're
very very hopeful. And I'm trying to remember Roberta, I forget her last name now. Roberta was from Canada, and her partner Amy. Amy's Reformed Jewish, and she introduced me to a Korean who's living in Leicester, or near Leicester, who's an expert on a Quaker Korean, who's a very important figure in Korea. So he's become a friend. We've had him give a talk. So Korea reaches even Leicester, England, an influence.
Mm.
So it's lovely. I mean, the other thing that one should say is that Japan and Korea were the first churches that the church went into for 40 years. The last church was 1921. There are no more churches till 1960, when the church was officially recognized in Korea and Japan. And then we have an explosion in the next decades of the church going into different countries, the globalization of Community of Christ. And Charles Neff was a part of that, an instrument of that. But Seoul and Korea and Japan are very important, and they knocked us off our Western perch in a very good way. There's a lot more that could be said about that.
Our next question comes from Jackie and Paul Bethel, and it's directed to Ui. They ask, do the congregations in Seijo or Okinawa have church services, or are they primarily schools today?
So in Tokyo, in Seijo, before the pandemic, so spring of, a while back now, gosh, they did meet every Sunday, and they would have tea time after church. And again, it was a small gathering, maybe 8 to 10 people, but a faithful small group. And then in Okinawa, they do not. There are members still scattered in the community, but they haven't been meeting for some time now. But both nursery schools are still very active and serving the community.
And they serve as Christian nursery schools. That's their ethos.
A note from Carl Lindman. He mentions that her last name is Jenkins.
That's right. Thank you,
Yes.
Roberta Jenkins. Uncle was the famous geneticist.
Mm.
Who
I'm going to
invented
step
nuclear.
in just to say for the time being, we have arrived at the end of our hour. The good news is our speakers have agreed to stay on to answer a few more questions after this. But for those who have to leave, I'll take this opportunity to say once again, thank you, Andrew, Phil, and Ui, for staying with us and extending your time today. We know that everyone can't stay past the hour and recognize some of you might have other obligations outside of church history discussions, but we invite you all to come back next week when we host Cristal Vanel. And Cristal will share a history of the RLDS Church Community of Christ in continental France, and he'll be sharing from France. And it is sure to be a great lecture. So just as a reminder that next week's lecture will once again start at 12 p.m. Central Time, 7 p.m. Paris time in Europe. And be sure to register online for next week's lecture at thehistoricsitesfoundation.org. And speaking of great programs, let's go back now and finish some of those questions. So I'll see, Barb, if there are any more questions in the queue that you might want to ask of our panel.
Thank you, Joey. There is a couple more questions in the queue. The next question comes from Myra Elliott. And Myra says, I lost my connection, so my question may have been answered. How did Brother Sekine become aware of the church?
So I don't know if Phil knows that. I don't know the details about that, but he became somehow associated in the houseboy of a church member American family in Tokyo.
That's my understanding, and I don't remember the church members' names, but I have heard that story, and Zucchini was very, very much indebted to them in friendship and opening up really a path that defined his life in most ways, but it was most respectful, and to have an opportunity as a young guy to go abroad. And I understand that he had, through some unidentified sources to me, that he could go to almost any university he wanted to. And he chose Graceland. And that provided contacts and support and networks that obviously still remain. He was most humble about that in the conversations he and I had, but he was so grateful for that original family who were U.S. military and were generous and genuine in their sharing with him personally.
Thank you, Phil. Our next question is directed towards you, Phil, and it's more on a personal level. The question comes from Girl Koontz, and he writes, question for Phil Caswell. Where do you live now, and how is your family? Philip was our apostle in West Texas and New Mexico back in the 1960s or 70s. I am Girl Koontz and live in Sun City, Georgetown, Texas now. I've really enjoyed all the program today.
Well, thank you very much for that, those kind words. Our family, Darlene and I, and our two sons, they are grown men now, but both of them live within, well, Brent and his family live within 15 minutes of our home. And Greg and his wife live in Overland Park, Kansas, and we are able to see them not as much as we would like, as everybody understands, but we are so grateful for two, they're outstanding young men in our view and in our love for them. Let's see, Darlene and I are active in the church at Stone Church, and we are privileged to share. Darlene is an ordained high priest. I am an evangelist, and we have continual opportunities to serve. The fact is that I won't speak for Darlene, but I have never been this old before. I'm getting kind of used to that. Our circles of influence are smaller, but we live near at least a dozen couples that are connected with the church in an assisted living facility and independent living with just within a couple miles of our place. We have not met as a congregation in person until for quite a period of time, until last Sunday, and we had our first in-person meeting with masks at Stone Church. I was not able to attend. Darlene did, but I had an opportunity to minister at Ray McLaren's memorial service. So we're engaged and so grateful for the memories and the associations and the fulfilling journey that has been ours through our association with the church and so many people. Thanks for that opportunity to share that.
Well, our next question comes from Phyllis Weaver, and she asks, what is our Ishikawa's background? What is Ui Ishikawa's background? How is she related to the Ishikawas in Hawaii?
Let me just start from the top. My grandmother, Susie, was converted. So she came into the church from the LDS church, and my grandfather is Walter Ishikawa. He's completely blind. He's still over here. He's 94. Grandma passed away already in 2010. They had the 4 children. My dad is Rex, my mom is Marvis, and I have cousins all over the island and all over the mainland. It's a big family, but yeah.
And your family, first of all, came from Okinawa, right? One part of it.
That's correct. I found out later, after I'd already been serving in the Far East for a bit, that my grandparents were good friends with the Sekine family. And so that was kind of a foundation too for Michio Sensei and me to build our friendship as well.
Well, thank you, Ui. You are filling us in not only on the recent history in Japan, but also on family history and genealogy. You're able to answer everything today, and I appreciate that. Andrew, the last question is for you. You are the co-founder of a new history organization called the British Isles Latter-day Saint History Association. You want to talk to us a little bit about that association and a little bit about the upcoming webinar that you'll be hosting on October 29th?
So this was founded informally between Peter Fagg, who's LDS, British LDS, and knows more about British Isles history on ground than anybody else I know. In fact, Bob would tell you that we employed him in the church history tour of of England and Wales that we did in 2017. So it's the ethos of the association is modeled on John Whitmer. You can say anything, but say it kindly. You can question everything, but be civil about it. So Peter Fagg was all right about that. And he was also pleased not to have to check in with our respective church institutions. So we're independent of any church. So it's like John Whitmer. So I'm really pleased about that. And our next lecture is by Matthew Rasmussen, or webinar is by Matthew Rasmussen. He's from Utah originally and works in Utah now. He did his mission in Manchester and then his PhD at Lancaster University. He's written a fabulous book about the LDS view of the church in the British Isles. He writes beautifully, elegantly, and is speaking on the 29th of October. And if you're interested, email me and I'll send you the link or how to register. And if you can't, my email address is abolton2 digit 2 at live.com. But if you forget that, contact Barb and she'll put you on to me. So we welcome, our audiences are good, and we're thrilled to have it international, even though the focus is the British Isles.
Thank you, Andrew. We have also put that link in the chats for anyone who wants to click on that to go and register for that lecture series. It is time now to bring our program to a close. So once again, a big thank you to all of our presenters today. And also, of course, a thanks to you, our friends in the audience, for your love of a good story and for generously supporting the Community of Christ historic sites with your donations. Thank you for your support. And once again, I encourage you all to tune in next week as we hear from Cristal Vanel speaking on a history of the RLDS Church Community of Christ in continental France. Wendy has already dropped a link to the Church History Without Boundaries webpage in the chat, and be sure to follow that link to register for next week's program. So until next Thursday, take care, everyone. Keep reading your church history and have a great morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you may be.
Redeemer of Israel, our only delight, on whom for a blessing we call, our shadow by day and our pillar by night, our King, our companion, our all. We know he is coming to gather his sheep and plant them in Zion in love. For why in the valley of death should they weep, or alone in the wilderness roam? How long we have wandered as strangers in sin, and cried in the desert for thee. Our foes have rejoiced when our sorrows they've seen, but Israel will surely be free. As children of Zion, good tidings for us, the tokens already appear. Fear not and be just, for the kingdom is ours, and the hour of redemption is near.